In this lecture, we're going to take a much more detailed examination of the research hypothesis. And the hypothesis is basically an educated guess that the researcher makes with respect to what might happen as a result of the research study. So this is typically developed prior to the execution of a research study. So what do you think might happen is a basic question that's generated when developing a research project. Sometimes the answer to this is truly a guess. So even with rigorous research into a topic, the researcher may not have a strong suspicion as to the outcome of a particular study. And the research hypothesis is based on knowledge. The second type of hypothesis that is critical to the research process is referred to as the statistical hypothesis, which evaluates the probability of an occurrence or the outcome of a study. Specifically, under the category of the statistical hypothesis, two hypotheses are examined for their viability. That would be the null hypothesis versus the alternative hypothesis, and that leads to a conclusion about the probability of type 1 or type 2 errors, statistical errors that can occur, and we will investigate statistical hypotheses later in the course. As part of the hypothesis development, in other words, the research hypothesis, the researcher should be familiar with scientific laws, and these are statements that are widely accepted in a particular discipline and is often based upon repeated and duplicated experimental observations. And these observations are very conclusive. One such example in the field of physics, for example, are Newton's laws of motion. Slightly different than scientific theory. Scientific theory is somewhat similar to a scientific law, but does not have the same level of conclusive acceptance by that discipline. So the study of psychology often relies more on scientific theories than scientific laws, as most disciplines do. So most disciplines do rely on scientific theories. Few scientific disciplines depend on established laws. And so scientific theories are very sound as the basis for research studies, and they are well substantiated explanations of a particular event. So once the hypothesis is established, or at least the process begins with developing the hypothesis, it can then be evaluated. To do so in a research context is to define clear variables. And these are elements in the study that can vary or assume different values. And we will examine variables in much more detail in this unit. Variables can be qualitative in nature or quantitative. When we think about a quantitative variable, we are applying a numerical descriptor to a particular variable of interest. Qualitative variables do not use numerical values. A constant in a study refers to a factor in a study that does not change. This could be a numerical value, or a constant can be used as a method of experimental control. So in defining a valid research study, confounding items that can influence the outcome of the study should be eliminated and controlled for. That occurs through setting up constant situations during the course of the experiment. In defining concepts for a particular study, there are two basic definitions that must be established. The first definition that should be established is what's called a conceptual definition. And that's where the researcher identifies an area of interest very generally. And the conceptual definition is widely accepted in a particular discipline. The operational definition builds upon the conceptual definition in context with the very specific research question. And so one such example is the conceptual definition of personality, which is defined as characteristic thoughts, emotional responses, and behaviors that are relatively stable in an individual over time across circumstances. This is a widely accepted conceptual definition, but is very difficult to implement per se as part of a research study. So the research study must take the conceptual definition and operationalize it, or rather restate the personality definition in a manner that can be specifically investigated in a research study. That specific approach is to identify what's called the Big Five. And these are 5 personality traits that can be measured along numerical scales. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism are 5 different or 5 elements or 5 traits of personality that are accepted in the field of psychology, and is a better estimate of personality than the previously mentioned type A and type B. The hypothesis statement in a research report should also be defined through whether it is deductive or inductive. So a deductive hypothesis is typically based upon a theoretical foundation that involves minimal direct observation. An inductive hypothesis is one that is developed based on research findings from other studies. And so patterns that are displayed in a few studies or many studies should be used as the foundation for the hypothesis if it is not based upon a deductive type of approach. And these include research papers, patterns that emerge within the public health realm as well. So the research hypothesis is essentially a statement of what the experimenter thinks will happen. And basically, variables in a study will be different or related to each other. This would be a clear research hypothesis statement. Or there would be no differences between variables or no relationships between variables. Sometimes the research hypothesis will be the same as the null hypothesis, which is the statistical hypothesis that will be tested numerically. But when we think about developing a research hypothesis, we do so without worrying about the statistical hypothesis. The research hypothesis should have a foundation on the theoretical elements of the research question and or previous experimental findings. So one example of the hypothesis statement in a research paper is illustrated in this paper published in 2011, and this is a segment of the final paragraph of the introductory section of this research paper, which is very common for many research reports. So in the final paragraph of the introductory section, we see that the first sentence states the purpose or objectives of the study. So this particular study had 1, 2, 3 different objectives. the objective statement is immediately followed by a clearly defined statement of the hypotheses in this particular study, because there were 3 hypotheses, and so each hypothesis was matched to each of the 3 different objectives. This is not always present in every research report, but when possible, this will provide the research approach with a more solid foundation. Another important element with the research hypothesis is a foundation for that research hypothesis. So we see that with hypothesis number 1, that healthy older adults will underestimate their perceived exertion across progressively greater contraction intensities. This hypothesis, rather than being a random guess, has a foundation in citation number 7. And so we see here that additional citations are used to provide as much foundation to why the researcher, in this case, developed these educated guesses. So when developing the hypothesis, a few other important elements that the researcher should take into consideration is that, does the hypothesis correspond with reality? And so the hypothesis should be consistent with past research, and as a result it should be foundational. Even if the hypothesis breaks with traditional thinking, it should be grounded upon previous research, or should be deductive in nature, that some theoretical foundation will serve as to why the researchers think something will happen as a result of executing the study. The researcher should consider whether the hypothesis is parsimonious or not, which is basically a process that examines the research question in a very economical way by stripping away as many complexities as possible. And so this involves making the minimum number of assumptions and relying on the most obvious explanation for a particular problem. This is captured within the very popular Occam's razor, which is based upon the idea that the explanation for an outcome is usually the simplest one. So how specific is the hypothesis can be captured in something called the Barnum effect, in that people will tend to believe general descriptions of their personality are actually highly accurate. And so an important element of the research process is to accept the probability or possibility that the hypothesis is false or it can be refuted. And so the research study must be executed in a way that the results will either refute the hypothesis that is stated or accept the hypothesis that is stated, thereby requiring the researcher to maintain an open mind as to what the outcome of the study can possibly be. So this ends part 2 of our Unit 2 lecture.